Having said that, Lance has a history of going back to school. He's been to over 200 schools, national and international around the world, and he's worked with about 150,000 students. Is that about right, Lance?
Yes.
So Lance probably has more experience in this area working with students in schools like ours than anybody else. That's all I'm going to say, because I think the best things are said by Lance, and I'll be listening. Thanks very much.
Buenos tardes. Sorry, that's a little bit of my everything Graham said was more or less right, except a bit about my chapters. And these chapters are absolutely perfect. I think Graham should write textbooks for a living. He does a wonderful job. But anyway, it's lovely to be here. This is the first time I've been in Mexico. As Graham said, I've come from Bermuda, a bit of a side trip. And I look forward to coming back again, possibly in the future. So, this is my business. My business is called The Art of Learning. I set this up 17 years ago. So I've been doing the same thing for 17 years. As Graham said, in 200 schools worldwide in 8 countries, and with about 150,000 students in total. And everything I do is focused on helping children to learn more effectively, more efficiently. And what I'll show you just a little snippet here. You know where I come from? I come from New Zealand. So here I am, I've come all the way down to Mexico. Work down here, work down here. So, as you know, New Zealand's at the top of the world. And I'm not sure that what I have to say is going to be relevant to you. I'm not sure about that, because New Zealand is quite a different place, and our education system is quite different, and my life is maybe different to yours, but there may be some things that are in common. I've just got this, included this photo, because this is the photograph from my house. So I live in a very small place in New Zealand called Raglan, on the west coast of the North Island, at the beach. And the only claim to fame Raglan has, this is a left-hand surf break. So we're famous for our surf. So this is my home. And I've always got to kind of check that maybe something I have to share will be of use, but maybe not, because my life may have been quite different. This is just down the road from my house, and this is my family. So I have 4 children. I have a son who's 28, another son who's 26, another son who is 21 yesterday, our daughter is 22, and this is my wife, Rebecca. I've indeterminate age. So this is my family. So I have 4 children, and those children taught me an awful lot about all sorts of things as they were growing up. So I think maybe I've got something that, out of my own experience of my children, that will be of use to you. Who knows? We'll see. What else? I have websites, and I have resources, and I have places you can go to get more information if you enjoy what we're here tonight. So I'll come to that shortly. These are the courses that I run, and I do a memory skills course for young children, years 6 to 8, which is an interesting thing, because memory skills, learning is much more than just memory. But memory skills is something that are not often taught. And yet you can make an enormous difference to a child's confidence and their ability to learn and understand just by teaching some memory skills. And suddenly they get the feeling that they can learn, that they can remember, that their brain does work really well. And it's a really interesting thing, because it's a very easy thing to teach, but it's not taught often how to memorize, memory techniques. So that's just a little half-day course that I put together. This is the course I ran yesterday, Learning About Learning, which is developing metacognitive awareness. Now that's a big word. What that means, all metacognitive means helping children to step out of their own learning and look at the processes they are using to learn whatever it is they're trying to learn. You see, the biggest difference between really good learners and poor learners is that the really good learners are prepared to try different ways to learn things. When they get something new, a new subject, something they're having difficulty with, they are prepared to try it this way, and if that doesn't work, they'll try it this way, and they'll try it this way. And to do that, you have to have metacognitive awareness. You have to have the ability to step out of the process you're using, the technique you're using, and look at it objectively, kind of from above, and think, is that working? And if it's not working, how else can I try that? And it's a very, very important thing. And poor learners don't tend to have that ability. They tend to get stuck in the problem itself. They get stuck in the biology or stuck in the maths, and they say, I just can't do this, I don't understand this, it's just not working for them. And they don't learn to step out, they haven't learned to step outside and look in. And that's a very important thing to learn to do. So that course is mostly about that. This course is exam confidence. It's usually done for older students. Today I'm doing it for the other half of year 9, and they cope with it very, very well. But usually it's done for students, it's straight exam skills, like what other skills you need to pass an exam. That's what this is all about. And so generally it's done for, here it would be Form 4 or Form 5 or Form 6 or Form 7, where they've got an imminent major exam that they want to get the skills for. But we did it with Year 9 today, it was perfectly fine. But they may not use those skills. They've got some exams at the end of this year, but hopefully they will keep those skills in readiness for GCSE when they get there, by GCSE. And then this last course is called Learning Resilience. And this is quite a different course, altogether different. Have we got enough chairs there? We're running out of chairs. Oh, you got that covered? Thank you. Thank you. There's always a couple of spare chairs at the front. Learning Resilience. Now this is, as it says here, strategies for developing flexible thinking, managing pressure, dealing with stress and developing resilience. And this is a much more general course, looking at thinking and learning and looking at strategies that children can learn to cope with difficulties, to cope with learning when it doesn't work well for them, to cope with stress and pressure. And it's quite a different thing. This came out of my master's degree. Quite recently, when I was 50 years old, I started my master's degree in education. And I completed it a few years ago. And my whole degree, master's degree, was involved in looking at developing resilience. And ever since then, all my work, everything I do, has got a thread of developing resilience that runs right through it. So some of this stuff was in today's course, some of this was in yesterday's course, but this is a course specifically focused on resilient development. Okay, so that's what I do. And every single thing that I try and do, and have done for the last 17 years, is focused on helping children to become more effective and more efficient learners. So you've got to think for a start. Oh, by the way, I do have a piece of paper that I'm going to hand out in just a second. I'm still kind of warming up. I'll just get through this stuff first, then I'll hand this out, okay? So we've got to think, what are the characteristics of successful learners? Now, I've got some possibilities. Do you think that these are some of the skills, characteristics, things that you'd like to see in your children, at least by the time they finish school, right? It is being able to focus and concentrate, self-motivated, good planners. You want them organised. You want them to be hard-working and persevering. Is that right? You want them to be independent researchers so they can find their own information. They don't need to rely on teachers anymore. You want them to be creative, forward-thinking, coming up with ideas that don't yet exist so they can change the world, right? You want them to be responsible for their own actions. You want them to be self-evaluating. They can look back at their own performance and self-correcting so they can make changes. Would that be good? Is this what we're after? Perfect. Okay. So the real question then is, so if you want all that, the self-regulated learner, that's what I call it, if you want all that, do you ever do any of these things for them? You ever do any of these things for them? The point being is the more you do these things for them, the less likely they are to be self-regulated learners. The less likely they are to take responsibility for their own actions, to plan out their own life, to fight their own battles, to achieve their own gains, to become self-resilient and self-reliant and self-managed. The more you do for them, the less they learn to do for themselves. Makes sense, doesn't it? And well, so is the aim to have your children develop as self-managed learners? Or do you want them to be dependent? You want them to be dependent on you forever? No. Okay, so of course all these things we do for our children when they're little. But as they grow up, there has to be a point where you stop doing these things. and help them develop those skills for themselves, because these are the key skills. And of course, it's not just this. Do you also do any of these things? Provide them with all the necessities of teenage life? Like money, like a cell phone, like a TV, like a computer, access to broadband, an iPod, personal transport. And the real question is, if you do provide these things, in return for what? What do you get? You see, the question is, when you were a child, did you get any of these things given to you? Of course, most of them didn't exist. Or did you have to earn what you got? You see, this is the problem, isn't it? This is the dilemma. Because if our children get given all these things, they don't have to earn them, what value do they put upon them? And these are all material possessions. Do you want your children to value material possessions? Or to feel like they should be granted them? So that's the key question, isn't it? And this is the value question. What do you want your children to value? So you only tend to value things that you earn. Is that right? So yes, what do they have to do to get these things? There's a couple of chairs here. I can see one empty chair here, one empty one there, one there, one there. If you want to come forward and sit down, please feel welcome to do so. So that's a couple of questions for you to ponder. And you've got to think about one of the key things, is that what do you think the world is going to be like in 20 years' time? It's almost an impossible question, isn't it? Because you think back 20 years ago, somehow we survived without all these things. Somehow. How did we do that? I don't know, no idea. How did we do that? We survived without all these things. And we survived quite well, didn't we? Seemed to be okay. And these are all things that are in our lives now. So what is going to be in our lives in that kind of same kind of technological area in 20 years' time? There's no way we can know. In fact, everything we can think of is probably just an addition to what we've got. But of course, it won't be just an addition. It'll be all brand new. So it's an interesting question to ask, because in 20 years' time, your children are going to need the skills to cope with the world in 20 years' time. So the question is, what are the skills that they're going to need? What are the skills that they need now in order to cope with the world of the future? And it's a big question. And it's impossible to predict, isn't it? And it's an interesting question. And here's some facts. This is the world today. There are something like 6 billion cell phones in the world today, active cell phones. Now, if that was one cell phone per person, there's only 7 billion people in the world. So that's 80-something% of the world's population. Of course, it's not one cell phone per person, but it's getting up to those limits. 85% of new phones are web-enabled. And I've been asking this question of students in class for quite a long time now. How many of you have got a web-capable phone? And I'm up to about 80% of students in most classes that I teach have a web-capable phone that they're not allowed to use. That's an interesting thing. There are 2 billion broadband subscriptions, 255 million websites, 150 million blogs, 8 trillion text messages, look at this, 107 trillion emails, 89% of them are But that's now. Like, this is not the future. This is now. This is today. So what is the future going to be like? Who knows? But it's going to be different. And I think in education, we're actually seeing a bit of a revolution, a bit of a change worldwide. To a change from teachers providing content, being transmitters of content, to teachers stepping aside from that, enabling students to find their own content, and teachers becoming facilitators of process, helping them ask the right questions, helping them plot a path and a pathway, which is great because that helps students to become self-managed learners. So if all the information is available 24/7 to every child, then maybe they can learn to manage that pathway. So I think that's an exciting future. And yes, so this is the question. How long will it be before your child has 24/7 access to multimedia information on every possible subject? It's not long, is it? I mean, what's the very first thing your child does when they wake up in the morning? The very first thing. Before they go to the bathroom, before they do anything else. Just check their phone, isn't it? Isn't that what everyone does? Wake up and check phone, what's happening? You know, it's just what's happening. It's the world. And we don't want to resist that world. We've got to go with the flow. It's got wonderful advantages and wonderful possibilities out there. So what I think there is a solution to this. It's not a difficult task. What we have to do to help our children cope with this world that we can't even imagine is what we've got to do is we've got to help them develop flexibility of thinking, adaptability, and the ability to learn. The ability to learn brilliantly. We want them to be able to learn anywhere, anytime, from anyone, in any style, through any medium. We want them to be able to be brilliant learners. That's all. Because if they're brilliant learners, it doesn't matter where they are or what the world's like, they will be able to cope, they'll be able to take advantage where they need to. They'll be able to do well, as long as they can learn well. And this is the mission of secondary education these days, is to help children become brilliant learners. So we've got to move from a knowledge-based, memorisation-based school curricula to a skills-based, learning skills-based curriculum, where children, the aim of education is to produce brilliant learners. It's not to produce people who can name, the colours of 17 different compounds when they're burnt in a flame in chemistry, or can name all the moons of Europa or whatever, What we want is children who can learn brilliantly, with full access to all the information on the planet, and with skills like being able to compare, contrast and validate the information they've got. That's a key skill. It's not just to take rubbish off the net, to actually take stuff, validate it from 3 or 4 different points of view, confirm it, check it, and then use that information as being good information. And this is a critical time in the world right now. It's a critical time, because we're nearly at the point where most kids have got access to this kind of information most of the day. So, challenge for teachers, colleges, and the challenge for parents, because I think parents can help with this to a great deal. Okay, there's the last one, using any resource. Okay, so I'll go back a bit and then I'll go forward. So what's success made up of? I think success at school is made up, partially at least, of ability and effort. Would you agree? Would you agree with that? Graham, how many handouts do you think we've got here?
60.
Probably less than we've got in the room.
Yeah, okay.
If it's possible, I'm going to hand these out now. If it's possible, could you just, if your husband and wife team are over, could you just share one between two? We'll see how far we get. Would that be all right? Okay. We can go and photocopy some more. It's not a problem. We'll get more by the end of the evening. But just now, so that everyone's got some, can you just hand them out down the rows over here? Okay. And just pass it back. Probably. I would say yeah, we're going to get some more made, it's okay. And everything that's on there is also up here, so you will get one if you haven't got one. So it's coming. So ability plus effort. What do you reckon? Ability plus effort. Of those two things, well, first, do you agree that success, you think, is made up at least partially of those two things? Okay, so which do you think is more important, ability or effort? Effort. Parents always think effort, and it's absolutely true. I totally agree with you. The question, of course, then is, how do you get your children to put in maximum effort? How do you do that? Because that's always the problem, isn't it? I often ask students, how much effort do you think you're putting in at school on an average day? And the reply is usually around 40%. Because they're saving up at least 20% for, challenges, but they never do more than 60%. And why stress? So everyone's burning. School is, for most teenagers, school is a real interruption to their social life, You've got to get something you've got to just get through and hopefully get out the other end safely. But how do you get children to put in effort? Well, the key thing seems to be, I've got some authors at the end of this presentation. I've got a list of some authors I suggest you read. But I'll write one up here. Carol Dweck, some people might be familiar with. She is Professor of Psychology at Stanford University. She wrote a book called Mindset, which is all about this thing about ability versus effort, and flexible thinking versus fixed thinking. But to sum up a lot of her work, basically what she found was that children either have a belief that it is their effort that makes the difference in learning certain things, or it is their ability. And that belief generally seems to be created by the feedback they've got through their life about things that they've done, by praise, which generally comes from parents. And the key thing seems to be is that the concept of ability seems to be like a fixed concept inside of a person. You have a certain ability. It's kind of the word seems to suggest something that's kind of fixed. And because it's fixed, if we focus on ability, we're not giving the child any possibility of changing that, of growing that, of developing that. We're saying you're very smart, you're very talented, you're really brainy, but that's suggesting something that's fixed inside them, not something that's going to grow and develop. So that doesn't produce the resilient learner, the one that focuses on growth and development. Whereas if we are praising effort, if we're making sure that we're catching a child when they're putting in hard work and we're saying it's wonderful to see how much effort you put in, how determined you are, how persistent you are, we're focusing on something that they can always do more of. And so that's something they feel they've got some control over. You see, okay, come back to it in a second. So here it is. So praise for effort, you're so hard-working, persistent and determined, is linking approval, your approval, to an attribute of the child over which they have control. They can always grow and develop more of it. And assessment then becomes a measure of progress, an opportunity to learn. So when they get a certain grade, a certain score, it's something they can manage and they can deal with and they can grow and develop and do more of. But when we are focused on appraising our children from their ability, you're so smart, tell them. It's wonderful to see. Well, unfortunately, what we're doing is we're linking our approval to an attribute of the child over which they have no control. And so assessment then is a challenge. And it's a challenge, it's a critical judgment, an opportunity to fail. It's a challenge to their ability. So assessment, they're scared of assessment. And they get this fear of failure. Someone in this kind of thinking, in this kind of mindset, is not afraid of failure, because failure just means, well, I've obviously got to put in more effort next time, or maybe it's strategy use. So those are the two things that children can control. The effort they put in and the strategy, the technique they can use. Those are the two things. So if we're focused on that, what we're doing is we're giving the child a possibility of change, a possibility of growth and development. If we're focused on ability, then we're not giving them a possibility of change. And this is important. Does that make sense? Okay. So, developing resilient learners, this is what I'm kind of my theme. The first piece of that is to catch them working hard. Is to focus any praise that you're going to give your children. Focus your praise for achievement on observed effort rather than ability. It has to be observed effort. You know, you can't go home from this workshop and go home and open your bedroom, daughter's bedroom door and say, it's wonderful to see how much effort you're putting in. And she'll go, yeah, Mum's been doing another seminar, yeah, okay. And she won't take any notice of that. You've got to catch your child putting in effort. And of course it doesn't necessarily mean in schoolwork. You know, it could be in any field. You know, whatever they're doing, if they're putting effort in, get them to notice the connection between the effort they put in and the result they achieve. And then try and transfer that into a school setting. Try and transfer that to imagine what you could achieve if you put that much effort into algebra. Or that kind of thing. Get them to transfer it. But it's building up that belief inside them that it's effort that makes the difference. Effort and strategy use, as I mentioned, because that's the second thing. Help them to focus on the processes of learning, the strategies they're using as the best source of improvement. Building, as I was talking about before, metacognitive awareness. So this is all learning is made up of strategy, of technique, of the way in which they are approaching the learning problem, the way in which they are writing the essay, the way in which they are doing the scientific analysis, the way in which they are doing the maths. It's all technique and strategy. And so the two things they've got control over is the effort they put in and the strategy they use, the technique. And those are the things to focus on. So if a child has a problem, doesn't get the result they want in a test, for example, you've got a couple of options, haven't you? Well, let's just imagine this. Let's just imagine little Johnny comes home and he's got 40% in a maths test. What do you do about that? So he's come home and he said, what did you get in the maths test? I got 40%. So you've got a few options, haven't you? You can go, oh, there, Johnny, it's all right, it doesn't matter, you don't, maths was never very important for me, you know, it's okay, you're a good boy, we love you still, it's all okay. You could go that way. You could say, well, you're obviously an idiot. That's another way you could go. Or you can ask the question, you could say to little Johnny, you could say, how did you do that? How did you do that? And actually ask them, what did he do in order to achieve that result? And actually get them to map it out. Well, I did this, and I did this, and I did this, and I probably didn't do this, and get him to actually map out the strategy that he used, the study that he did, the work that he did, which resulted in 40% of the maths test. And then you ask him the key question. If you had the chance to do that again, would you do it any differently? What could you change? Get them to make some changes, and then get them to have another go. It's so important to get them to have another go at that same thing, to learn from. See, one of the other key things about, it's kind of the same thing about the best learners in the world, is that when they get 40% in a maths test, let's say it's a 10 question maths test, so they got 4 out of 10 right, they got 6 out of 10 wrong. Those who are great learners will look at those 6 out of 10 they got wrong and they'll reprocess every single one and they'll work it through and they'll consult with the teacher or the textbook or whoever they need to do to find out how to get the right answer. And they'll work it through until they know, until they understand what they did wrong, and then they'll put it behind them for each of those 6 questions they got wrong. Those who are not great learners will look at a 40% maths test and say, oh, it doesn't really count. And they'll ignore it. So they'll never make that progress. They'll never get better at it. They'll stay in the same place. So that kind of thing, a focus on process. How did you achieve that result? And if you had another chance, would you do it differently? It's a great way to focus. So you focus on the process. Okay? Does that make sense? Yes. Oh, sorry. It was a different country I was in last week. Okay. So, and the last thing is this critical thing about helping them to learn from their mistakes. But to learn from mistakes, they've got to be able to make mistakes. And in my research that I did for my master's degree, this, just what I've been talking about, was the critical factor that distinguished the learners who are getting the very best results from the one at the very bottom. The distinguishing factor between those two groups, and it was 100% significant in the research I did, was this thing here. The most significant difference between the high achievers and the underachievers was all the high achievers had learned how to, what I'm calling, fail well. And that's the person who goes back and reprocesses what they got wrong, and learns from that and then moves on. Whereas all the underachievers were failing badly. Now there's only one way to fail well, and there's lots and lots of ways to fail badly. And this is what I discovered. In terms of reactions to failure. Now, I better stop for a second, because the word failure is a real emotional word, and people get a bit attached to get a bit afraid of the word failure. What I mean by failure is not achieving a goal that you set for yourself. That's all. Just not achieving a goal that you set for yourself. And all failure, if you're focused on the process, all failure is feedback. It's just giving you information about what you haven't done right yet. And you can either ignore that, or you can do something with it. And those who were achieving at the very top level, academically top-passing students, had all learned how to do this. Acknowledge failure, say, yep, I didn't get the result I wanted. To take responsibility for their own actions, to say, yep, well, I suppose I could have done more of that, more of that, more of that. To analyse the process used, work out what they did, and then make the changes, and then have another go, try again. And this was only one way to fail well. But there's a whole lot of ways to fail badly. And so what I had in my group of students that I was researching was a whole lot of different ways that students were failing badly. One was shifting blame to others. It wasn't my fault, it was her fault, it was his fault, school's fault, the teacher's fault, always someone else's fault. Ignoring or denying failure. This was students who were performing really badly. They were saying, no, everything's fine, I'm doing fine, everything's okay. Catastrophizing. This is an interesting one, kind of a made-up word. What it means is that when someone gets a result, that they don't like, so I only got 60% in the social studies test, and my life is over. So they add a whole lot of drama to it, as much drama as possible, because if you add a whole lot of drama to a problem, it's too big to deal with, isn't it? You can't deal with it, it's just too big. So you've got to ignore it. So catastrophizing, expecting failure. These students were top achieving students, the best students in the school, and yet some of them weren't doing well. And some of them went into those kind of things saying, I'm going to fail this, I know I'm going to fail this, predisposing themselves to failure. There was another group of students that were actively avoiding any activity that could result in failure. So these were children who were plotting their path through school, making sure that they only ever did things they were already good at. Only ever doing things they were already good at. And I mean, occasionally they might try something different, but the first time they had any failure, and then they dropped that like a hot potato and go back to what they were already good at. And so they ended up with a really narrow range of subjects they were focused on, and so they didn't develop flexibility, and they never learned how to cope with failure. And that's the thing with all these things. None of these students had learned how to cope with failure. And the last one was a couple of students who were universalising failure. They were saying everything in my life is a failure, total failure. I mean, I can remember one of these in particular was a boy who was a prodigy, a child prodigy with the cello. He was brilliant with the cello, he was in the National Youth Orchestra, and he was brilliant at chess. He won tournaments, brilliant at chess. And he said to me, everything in my life is a failure. And I said, what do you mean? You're in the youth orchestra, you've won these things, you're brilliant at this. He said, oh no, they didn't know. What do you mean? He said, oh no, I just fooled them. It was just luck. You know, he had this whole story in his head that he was no good at any of these things, despite the evidence in front of him. He would totally ignore all the evidence and just continue on in his self-belief that he was a total failure and his whole life was a failure. Terribly sad kind of story. But you know, there seemed to be lots and lots of ways to fail badly, but there was only one way to fail well. Now, if you take on board this model, this idea, what you've got to realise is for the first time, in dealing with any task, in dealing with anything at all, in trying your best, there's three outcomes now. There isn't just pass or fail. There is pass, fail well, or fail badly. And two of those things are really good. Passing and failing well are brilliant. It's only failing badly that's bad. So you see, suddenly it's completely changed the whole model of success to where it's okay to fail as long as you fail well, as long as you learn from that, as long as you reprocess it, work out what you did wrong, make some changes and have another go. Do it again. Make sure you do get that. Make sure you do understand that. Suddenly we've got another model. And I think it's wonderful because being afraid of failure is such a key thing in children. Being afraid of failure. It happens all the time. And we've got to break that. I'll show you one thing that we do on my courses to help with this. See in this box over here? In this box over here, and all around the world, I've got these things here. Now, how about, we've got a bit of time, how about I take the next 15 minutes or so and teach you all how to do this? How about that? How would that be? You see what's going through your mind right now? Because something's going through your mind. See, I've been to some people in the room. See, you're not sure whether I'm serious or not, eh? Something goes through your mind. So there'll be someone in the room who's saying to himself, oh yes, that'll be wonderful. I've always wanted to learn how to do that. That'll be fabulous. And there'll be someone else in the room who might be saying, oh yeah, might be right. Better than sitting here. And there might be someone else who's saying to themselves, oh no, not me, not going to get me up there doing that. And there might be someone else in the room who's saying, oh no, that's impossible, absolutely impossible. The man's completely mad, he's completely crazy, I could never do that, that's impossible, I can't do anything like that, it's no good, I can't do it. Now what you've got to realise is that those are reactions to a challenging situation. They're just reactions to being challenged with the possibility of getting out of your seats and learning to juggle. But it's alright, I'm not going to teach you how to juggle tonight, sorry. The point is that you notice your reaction to a challenging situation. You see, and what happens to us, of course, is instantly, I bet I produced a fear of failure in some people in the room. Is that right? You don't want to do it because you're afraid you might look stupid. You see, and that's a fear. We've all got it. We've all got this fear of failure. So how do we help our children get past their fear of failure? I don't know. What we do on our course is we help them to notice their reaction. We help them to notice what's going on inside their head. In particular, we help them to notice what they're saying to themselves and what they're imagining. And we do this really interesting little thing where we get your children, and I did this today, I did this yesterday, and we get them to notice their own self-talk, and we get them to notice when they say to themselves, I can't, and we get them to change that. Now you're all probably anticipating I'm going to write down there I can. Well, that's not what I do. I get them to shift from I can't to I haven't yet. From I can't to I haven't yet. Now this is critical, this is absolutely crucial. Now think about it in terms of that model I had up there before about the swim and Carol quick. The idea of a focus on ability or a focus on effort. You see, if a child is saying I can't do it, they're making what is called an ability attribution. They're attributing their lack of success. They're saying that the cause of their lack of success is a lack of ability. I can't. It's physically impossible for me. I can't. I don't have that ability. They're saying it's ability. They're saying it's in their genes. I can't do it. It's physically impossible. And that is attributing it to ability. If we try and shift them from I can't to I can, when they're saying I can, they are still attributing it to ability. So they'll say I can, but they'll know inside themselves that they're having difficulty with it. So that they're saying I can, but they're believing that it's still impossible for them. So then it's an incongruence. But every child will move from I can't to I haven't yet, because it's just true. If you haven't yet learned to juggle, well, you haven't yet learned to juggle. It's just a fact. Stick with the facts. But notice if you say to yourself, I haven't yet, you're making what you could call an effort attribution. You're attributing as the cause of your failure so far the fact that you haven't tried. I haven't yet. And you're opening up in your mind the possibility that maybe by changing strategy or putting in some more effort, maybe you might. It's possible that you might. And you see, that's all the mind needs. To have more success, all you've got to have in your mind is the possibility of success. And so, if your children were on one of the courses I did today or yesterday, from now on forever, anytime you hear them sitting down doing their homework and you hear someone say, I can't do this maths problem, all you've got to say to them is that a can't or is that just a haven't yet? And they go, oh, that's right, I haven't yet done it. And then you say, so, let's have another go. Can you do it a different way? Can we come up with a different strategy? Is there another way we could do this? You see, and you're helping them overcome their own fear of failure. You're helping them overcome that block in their mind that goes with I can't. So I really suggest you take this on board and you help your children, and some of you have got very young children, I'm sure, and you help them shift from I can't to I haven't yet. So they're not, and of course they might say I haven't yet, and I'm not going to. Well, that's fine, that's their choice. But they're not saying it's physically impossible for themselves, they're making an active choice, which is what we're after, isn't it? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Now I've been talking for a while. Anyone got any questions you'd like to ask so far? Yes? Sorry, I'm a little deaf, so I'll have to come closer to you.
The strategy sounds great, but in the real world, you are judged by your ability to accomplish it. So at some point, you have to balance out the ability to go from I can't to I haven't yet to I actually can do it and will do it.
Yeah.
And at some point, when they're teenagers, you have to shift them a little bit into you have to. You can't give them the option of always bowing out, right?
Well, I kind of disagree with what you're saying a little bit, and then I don't think you judge by ability, I think you judge by results.
Okay.
And the best way to get results is to have a good process. You see, this is always the suggestion, but if we're not teaching them content, if we're focused on the process, how will we know that they know their stuff? Well, you see, the way in which we learn is through good process. So you actually produce better results by focusing a child on the process they're using. Now, I hear what you're saying. You're saying that if we let them opt out all the time, then they're not going to achieve the results that we want them to achieve. But you see, I disagree, because I think that when they say that I haven't done it yet, all it does is encourage them to have another go. Because in their mind, what they're suggesting to themselves is that they, see the word yet, suggests that I'll have another go. So if they have another go, they focus on process, they focus on effort, they are much more likely to get a result than if they get stuck in I can't. That's all. And yeah, I guess that children prove to themselves that they have ability by virtue of discovering that they have some control in a learning situation. They prove to themselves, by doing this and doing this and doing this, I produce this result. And I think it's an unfortunate thing for a child, for example, to get through schooling without ever having put in any effort. You know, the really gifted children, the really precocious children who manage to get right through schooling without putting in effort. And I think that's really unfortunate because they've never learned connection between working hard and achieving a result because the challenge hasn't been high enough. So of course we've got to continually raise the challenge. We've got to continually get them to push themselves against the challenge barrier and get them to, but it's got to be okay to fail. It's got to be okay to fall over. It's got to be okay to not get it right and learn from that and move on and have another go. So I probably didn't answer your question at all, but anyone got any other comment? Question? Okay. So I think there are some ways in which we can help our children to become more resilient in their learning. And one of them is to encourage them to take on new challenges and use failure as feedback. So to do things that they don't feel comfortable with, to do things that are outside their comfort zone. And I'll just tell you one story of my family, and then what I'm going to do is give you a couple of minute break to stand up and stretch and move around a bit, and then we're going to finish this off. So, take on new challenges. So what can you put in front of your child that is a challenge, something they really have to push themselves to achieve, that they can learn from? I mean, sport works really well like this. You know, trying your hardest at a sport, any sport at all. Because what happens is you learn how to fall over and get back up again, and fall over and get back up again, and fall off the horse and get back on again, that kind of thing. Sport, physical activities, all those things work well. I'll tell you one experience I had with my children. As I said, 4 children. And when they were younger, and the youngest would have been about 13, the oldest would have been about 18 or 19, in New Zealand we have this thing called bungee jumping. You know what bungee jumping is?
Yeah.
Do you have those in Mexico?
Yep.
Yeah? Who's been bungee jumping here? 1, 2, 3, 4. Excellent. Wonderful. Okay, so that's your challenge. The rest of you, go bungee jumping. Well, you see, what you have to do to go bungee jumping is you have to overcome your fear. Now, all fear is, it's a mental process. It's just something going on in your head. It's your head. Take control of it. Take charge of it. You see, if your children can learn how to do that, they gain a more enormous strength. So when I was at home, it was a long time ago. So 10 years ago, my oldest is 28 now. So 10 years ago, my wife was away for the weekend. I'm not sure if that had anything to do with it, but I said to my kids, do you want to go bungee jumping? And they went, yeah, right. So we're off, big adventure. So we go across in the car, across to another city where the bungee jumping was happening. And I had done it once before, so I knew what to expect. So while we're driving over there, I'm really cruel, you see, to my children. So as we're driving over there, I'm saying to them, I'm telling them what's going to happen on the bungee jumping thing. Because it's all like this. What happens is you're sitting down, you're way up in the air, like 120 metres off the ground, something like that. And you're on a little platform, or you're in a cage, or you're under a bridge, something like this. And what happens is you're sitting down, and the guy straps you all up and straps this really thick rubber cord to your legs. And then what he does is he tries to get you to jump without thinking. So what he does is he counts you down. He goes 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, bungee. And what he says to you is, on 5 I want you to stand up. On 4 you take 1 step forward. 3, 2, 1, bungee. And by then you're at the edge and you jump, you see. Because he wants you to do it before you think about it. Because if you think about it, you might not do it. And then you won't get paid. So from his point of view, he needs you to do it without thinking. But you see, I said to my children as we're driving over, I said to them, this is what he's going to do, and I described all this. And I said, if you want an extra challenge, don't let the guy count you down. Tell him to be quiet, and shuffle up to the edge of that drop, and look down at that 120-metre drop, and notice that voice inside your head that's screaming, and it's screaming, it's saying, you're going to die, you're going to die, don't do it. And it's just like that. It's just like that. There's this amazing pressure not to jump. You know, your whole mind is going, get back, get back, get back. And you've got to get over that. So I said to my children, if you want to do that, you'll notice this screaming loud voice, and just take a moment and try and calm it down. Try and quieten that down. Try and relax your whole body and quieten that voice down and quieten it down and quieten it down until it's quite quiet, and then jump. Make it a deliberate action. Now, bungee jumping in New Zealand, by the way, is totally safe. There has never ever been any injury in New Zealand, and we invented it. A.J. Hackett created the sport. I suppose the Papua New Guineans actually created it, but they just had vines around their feet, so they jump off and break their legs, I guess. So he created the whole rubber thing for the bungee thing. It's perfectly safe. There's never been any injury. It's a lot safer than it looks, but anyway, it's still an enormous challenge. So I had no fear of my children injuring themselves, so up there, and I told them to do, and I said, you don't have to do that, you do it anyway, you don't even have to go up on a thing if you don't want to. But I guess there was a little bit of peer pressure going on there. So I went up first and I did it, jumped off, that was all good, and then all four of them did, and they all did it that way. They all told the guy to be quiet, they shuffled up the edge, they took a deep breath, they quiet, and they did it. And that was such an empowering thing, such an amazing thing for them. Because what they learned to do was they learned to recognise the fear. They learned to quieten down that fear, take control of themselves and do it anyway. And it was amazing. I mean, as the older they were, the more difficult it was for them. You know, the 18-year-old, you could see him from where I was, there's a chin, there's muscles for him to get up. The youngest one, the 14-year-old, is kind of nothing going on at all. But by the time they all got down, we all got down the bottom, like they were 10 foot tall. I don't mean they've been stretched. And they felt 10 foot tall. And from there on, they always refer back to that as one of the most amazing moments of their life, where they learned that they could do anything, that they learned that they could challenge their own fears, that they learned they could do something that looked really hard, that something that was difficult for them to do. So I don't know what equivalents you could do for that, but I think it's a really useful thing to do, to help your children challenge themselves. Challenge their own fears, challenge their own boundaries, and get through that. Because it teaches them amazing I was going to say discipline. It's not discipline, it is belief in themselves, belief that they can do amazing things. And you know, I often say to kids in class, I try and ask them things like, what is the most difficult thing you've ever done? And how did you get yourself to do it? Because that's your motivation strategy, right there. But often teenagers have never done anything particularly difficult, so it doesn't work so well. But I'm trying to get them to think about how do they get themselves to do difficult things. Because when you think about it, you know, there's a great saying, successful people do the things that unsuccessful people don't want to do. They don't want to do them either, but they've got drive and determination that gets them through. And I say to kids, like, is GCSE going to be hard? They say yes. And I say, does that make it worth doing? And of course it's worth doing because it's hard. Because if it was easy, it would be worth nothing. If it was easy, everyone would have one. Because it's difficult, it's worth doing, but you've got to know how to handle difficult stuff. So how are you going to handle it when you know it's going to be hard? How are you going to get yourself to do what's hard? Because getting yourself to do what's easy, well, that's easy. Getting yourself to do what's hard, that takes deliberate strategy. And this is self-motivation strategy. This is challenging yourself. Okay? So let's take a 2-minute break. Stand up, have a stretch, introduce yourself to someone you don't know, ask me any questions you want, take a break.
Just ask a question.
Wonderful to see that I've managed to stimulate some discussion. Great. Okay, so moving right along. So that was the challenges thing. Those are basic challenges, and overcoming challenges. You learn resilience, you learn to cope with difficulties and failure. But of course you've got to know what is an appropriate challenge for your children. You don't try and make them all bungee jumping. That might be way too much for them. You've got to find the challenges that are appropriate. You know, and make sure they're safe. Make sure the challenges are safe for them. But you get the idea. Another thing about resilience is that every child falls over occasionally. Every child has difficulties. Every child has times when things don't work well for them. And every child recovers from that. So a really neat thing to help your children notice is to help them notice their own strategies for recovery from adversity. Now this is an interesting thing, because when your children are really little and they fall over and skin their knee, and they cry and cry and cry, and then after a while they forget about it and they get back up again, it's It's really neat to say to them, it's wonderful to see how quickly you recovered from that. It's wonderful to see how you got yourself back up and you got happy again. And it's a neat thing because you're getting them to notice something that just happens naturally by itself. And the more they notice it, the more they get the idea that maybe they have some control in there. Maybe it's something they are doing, which is helping them do that. And as they get older, you can even pose the question like that. So when they have some kind of emotional disaster or something, and then a few days later they're feeling better again, it's really neat to ask them, how did you do that? You seem to do that really well. How do you get yourself back to happy again? How do you do that? Get them to start thinking about it. Because there will be something that they're doing, but they may not even be noticing what they're doing. So they might be saying something to themselves, they might be distracting themselves with something else, they might be going out and just working out some energy somewhere, they might be visualizing something. There's bound to be something that they're actually doing that they don't even think about. You see, the greatest, that's right, perfectly fine. The greatest mental illness in teenagers today is depression. And not clinical depression, bipolar depression that needs medication, just normal depression, just feeling sad and feeling miserable and feeling down. But that still can have terrible, terrible consequences. Children can spiral down to terrible things. And often I think, certainly, that is because they don't feel they've got any strategy to deal with that. They're just going to let it run its course. And they spiral. They start giving themselves negative messages and noticing how bad they feel and telling themselves how bad they feel and going worse and worse and worse. So but through their life you have said things like, have you noticed how you get yourself back to happy? How do you do that? How do you get yourself back to happy? Then they'll have the feeling already that they've got some control. There is something they can do to get themselves back to happy. And that's an important thing, I think. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
I have a question.
So, yes.
I really like what you said about when your child goes through a sad phase and then he or she turns out better and then you say, how do you do that? I really like that. I mean, very good. And then what do you do while they are in the bad phase, while they are in a sad phase, or while they are saying to themselves, I don't want to say I'm happy. But what do you do when it's an emotional thing? What do you suggest?
Well, okay. And of course, it all depends on how severe it is. But I would say, do nothing at all. Just completely ignore it. But I mean, not in every case. I mean, a good friend of mine had this wonderful analogy. He said, and he deals a lot with difficult children, and he said, what parents have to do is what they've always done. When your children were really little, and they made a mess in their nappies, you didn't add any drama to that, did you? You dealt with it as undramatically as possible. So you got it down, you held your breath, you got it down, you wanted it, clean it, put it in your nappy, no drama, right? Now that's the model. But when a child is a teenager, and life is over, it's terrible, deal with it like changing a nappy. So that's interesting, dear, what are you going to do about that? Oh, it's no. That's interesting, what are you going to do about that? Oh, sure, oh, well, okay. Come and see you later when you've thought of something you can do about it. Try and ignore it as much as possible. Do not get involved in it. Do not dive into it. Do not buy into any part of the drama. Drama is what you don't need. What you need is a strategy. Okay, so what are you going to do about it? I can't deal with it. My life is over. Oh, well, okay. See you later. Of course, they're not if it's actually a serious problem. But all they're trying to do is convince you that it's a serious problem so you can get involved, so then they can dump a whole lot of it on you. You see? Because it's so much easier than dealing with the problem themselves is to give it to mum. That's the best way to deal with this, is to give it to mum. But you don't need it. And children have to learn how to fight their own battles. They have to learn how to deal with their own messes. And have to learn how to separate the drama from the reality. So think of that nappy example. The next time your child is having a whole lot of drama, just think about that nappy example. Deal with it as quickly, as efficiently, as simply, without any drama as possible. Just get past it, get over it. Okay? And focus on action. Action. What are you going to do about it?
Fantastic advice.
Sorry?
Fantastic advice.
Oh, thank you.
I have a question.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Lance,
okay, there's an interesting slide. I hope you didn't see that, because I'm going to tell you the story about it. Oh, yes,
I
sorry.
have a totally different question. You were
Sorry, I
saying,
can't hear. Sorry, starting.
Totally different on another note.
Yep.
You were saying success equals ability plus effort. So kids that are high on ability tend to be low on effort. right? Because
Often,
it's
yes.
easy for them to get
Yes,
success
absolutely.
because ability is high.
Yes.
How do you get them to do more effort?
You raise the challenge.
Yeah,
You've got to raise the challenge.
you raise a challenge.
Absolutely.
Right.
The worst thing a child can do is get through all of their schooling without putting in any effort. It just means the challenge isn't high enough.
So how do you do that in school?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's to do with the school structure. I know nothing about the school structure. Actually, it's a good lead into what I was thinking about, which is one of the problems I have with schooling is the whole idea of advancing children depending on their age rather than their ability. When you think about it, it's crazy. So suddenly they're 14 and they've got this ability, and then they're 15 and they've apparently got a different ability. And instead of advancing by ability, so let's say your child is a fabulous artist, but they're still in the Form 3 art class where they're doing simple stuff, whereas they could be in the Form 7 art class for art, but they still need to be in the Form 3 class for mathematics. Now, it takes a very, very flexible school to enable that to happen, but imagine, wouldn't that be great if a child moved to the level of their ability, which is the level of their challenge, the point where they're not finding it easy anymore. That's where they need to be in every subject. So I don't know how that can be accommodated in a school. I don't know anything about this school. But if it's not happening in the school, then maybe you can do it outside of the school. The things that they are good at, find a way to get them up to the point where they are challenged. Find a way for them to have a tutor, or have a teacher, or have a friend, or have a course, or have an experience where they are actually challenged. And the other thing, of course, is that take them completely out of context, you're completely out of school stuff, and put them on the spirit of adventure we have in New Zealand, which is a sailing ship that kids go on and learn how to sail. And generally it works best for kids who know nothing at all about sailing. So it's a totally out of context experience where suddenly they're challenged to a whole lot of stuff they know nothing about. So even for the really gifted, suddenly doing that is a real challenge. So I guess you've got to come up with these things as best you can. But yeah, school is a really interesting model. We have this kind of linear model of school, where you go through the best kindergarten, through the best primary school, and the best secondary school, and the best university. And I don't think it's necessarily a very good model. You see, I'll give you a good example. To tell you about my life. What happened with me was that when I was about 11 or so in what we call intermediate school in New Zealand, we have these funny things in between primary and secondary. It was recognised that I had a little bit of talent in sciences. I seemed to have application in science. I seemed to be quite good with sciences. From there on to the end of my schooling, when I was 18, I did 3 sciences. I did chemistry, physics and biology, right through my secondary schooling, plus English and maths and a few other little bits and pieces. I never did art, I never did music, I never did drama, I never did any of those things at all. So how would I find out if I was good at any of those things? Purely because I had an aptitude for sciences, I did 3 sciences all the way to the end of my school. So then obviously the next thing to do was to go to university. It was obvious. And so obviously I had to do a science degree. Now the only science degree I could do where I couldn't do the first year at my local university was food technology, which is 300 miles away. And the only thing I wanted to do was leave home. That was it. That was the only thing I knew I was passionate about getting out of. That was it. Wanted to get away. And so I did a food technology degree. No reason except that I'd shown an interest in science and I wanted to get away from home. So 5 years later I had a food technology degree. And I got a job and I worked in food technology and I was never particularly interested in it and I probably wasn't very good at it. And just through another random chance, the birth of my first son, I ended up out of work and I ended up needing a job and I took a teaching job at a polytechnic, teaching 16-year-old girls office skills, of which I knew absolutely nothing. And they gave me the job, so I did that. And suddenly, it wasn't the office skills or the girls, it was the teaching. And I suddenly discovered that there was something I quite liked doing, teaching. I like being in the centre of attention. I like being up front. It was great. The office skills thing didn't appeal to me, so I moved across and I ended up teaching food technology, which was my degree. So I ended up teaching that, and that was quite good, except I'd never had a particular interest in food technology, microbiology and food processing and quality assurance and statistics and all that yucky stuff. So anyway, I did that for 5 years, and then I was really, really lucky to get a secondment into a department in the place, the technical university, that was the professional development department. and they were the people who taught the teachers about how to teach well. Suddenly I was teaching something that I discovered I enjoyed. But I was, I think, 37 years old by then, or 35, something like that, and I finally discovered what I enjoyed and what I was good at. And so that became my life's work after that, and eventually I ended up setting up this business. But you notice what happened? Purely because of disposition for science and some random accidents, I ended up doing stuff that I wasn't very good at, that I didn't particularly enjoy. Now, wouldn't it have been amazing if I had done education qualifications, like if I had left school and not gone to university, gone out and tried a whole lot of things and maybe fallen into a teaching position somewhere and discovered that's what I actually enjoyed and done a degree in education at that point. That would have been amazing. Because when you're doing what you love doing, what you have a passion for, it's not work anymore. It's play. A wonderful philosopher from the 1960s, a man named Alan Watts, he said smart people get paid to play. And I've taken that on board. I think it's a fabulous idea.
That is exactly what they are doing now in Japan. They are avoiding whatever is not really necessary, and they are doing what the kids really want to do.
Have a passion for it. That's fine. The problem is that if you go through the standard schooling system, you may not be exposed. You've got to be exposed to 1,000 things before you find your passion. But if children are actually finding their passion, then that's great. You see, some children do find it at school. Some children do find it what they're most passionate about. And then they get the degree in that subject and they go on and everything's fine. But I think going straight from school to university is not necessarily a good idea for a lot of children. I think a much better idea is to finish school and do anything else. Go travelling, go working, have a whole lot of different jobs until you find something that appeals to your heart. And we spend too much time training our mind, training our brain. We don't put enough effort into training our heart. And I don't mean training, I mean finding out what our heart wants. Finding out what feeds our spirit. If you know the man, you look on TED, you've done TED.com, wonderful website, TED.com. Wonderful man called Sir Ken Robinson from England, got a wonderful clip on there from which I just stole a line. No, you'll see that. But I think that's absolutely true. We want, and you see, if our children discover what they're passionate about, then they go and get good tertiary qualifications in what they're passionate about, and imagine what they can achieve then. So I think that, the linear model doesn't necessarily work. And the other thing I'd like to mention about secondary school is I think sometimes secondary schools train children to believe that their highest expectation is to be an employee, not to be an employer. And I think we've got to always raise that possibility. I bet there's lots of people in the room here who are business people, who have businesses, who run their own business, and do things like that. You're employers. It's a wonderful thing to be an employer. And I think it's fabulous if we can talk to our children about the possibility of generating their own business, the possibility of starting their own business, the possibility of employing other people, of utilising other people's resources and pulling them together and having great ideas and producing great products. And I think we don't focus on that. There's not a lot of schools that I know that have an entrepreneurship course. But I think entrepreneurship is a set of skills that any child can learn. So those are the things that I think are worth thinking about. Okay? Okay. Getting back to what's on the handout. Oh, that's right, this thing here. I've shown it twice now. Have you got the message yet? I didn't mean to put it up. It was to do with my wife and I are part owners in 2 childcare centres back in Raglan. Tiny little town, 2 little childcare centres. And husbands and wives are all kind of involved. And they're little businesses. And we had 1 childcare centre, and then we decided there was enough children to build a second one. So we built a second one. But we did the building ourselves. The fathers, this is kind of Kiwi dads, is what we tend to do. So it's together 3 families. We bought this property, big property outside town, lovely bush property, and it had a big house on it. So then we had to turn the house into a childcare centre. So one of the dads, 3 dads, myself and 2 others, one of them was a builder, and the other 2 were just, labour. And so we spent 3 months over Christmas one day rebuilding this house into a childcare centre, putting up slides and swings and fences and all that stuff. And we did it all ourselves. And the thing was, of course, our wives wouldn't let, I'm in education, the other 2 guys weren't, so they weren't that interested, but I wanted to have some input, How can I help? I could design some programs, I could do... No, they weren't letting me have any input whatsoever. I'm still not allowed to. But anyway, that's okay. They run the three wives, they run the whole thing. But I decided that I wanted to put a sign up. I wanted to put a sign up at the front of the childcare centre which would embody everything I thought would need to be in that childcare centre. And this was the sign. So I wanted to guarantee the right of every child to hurt themselves. I wanted to guarantee that. You see, and I think this is what's missing in the world today. You know, I mean, in New Zealand we don't have a very litigious culture. So if you fall out of a tree and break your leg, well, that's your tough luck. You know? You shouldn't have been climbing it. You know? You'll learn from that, maybe. You can't sue someone for that. You know, if anyone hurts themselves at our childcare centre, we can't get sued. There is no legislation to enable anyone to sue us. Unless it's deliberate child neglect or something, you know, actively, someone has actively done something horrible. Then we could be sued for that, but not for accidents. Accidents are part of life. And this is maybe a different, I don't know what it's like here in Mexico, I know in the United States. You know, there's 40,000 elementary schools in the United States where free play has been banned. The children aren't allowed to do free play anymore because they might have an accident. All play is organised and monitored by adults. I think that's totally the wrong way to go. You know, flying foxes and climbing frames have been banned because children fall off and hurt themselves. I think it's wonderful that they fall off and hurt themselves because maybe they'll learn something from it. So, needless to say, I wasn't allowed to put up my sign. Okay. So, moving on. Parent as teacher. I got this idea about one of the key roles for a parent, I think, is as a teacher. And one of the key areas, I think, we can be good teachers of our children is in providing them with good role models. Role models, and by that I mean biographies. You know, I just read the biography of Steve Jobs, biography, Apple founder. A wonderful biography, really worth reading. And he changed the world in so many different ways. He would have been an appalling person to work with, but he was a fantastic innovator, creating products that did not exist. Things like that. Biographies, your own stories. You know, I think sometimes as parents we tend to tell our children our stories of great success, when we worked hard and we achieved great things, and that's good. But do you also tell them the stories about when you didn't achieve great things, when you fell over, when things didn't work out, when you had some failure, some disaster, and how you coped with that, what you did with that, how you managed that? I think it's really good to teach your children, to tell your children all the bad stories as well as the good stories. Because they see you more as a real person who's had to struggle and had to work hard to achieve what you've got. So, and I guess most biographies, if you read them of famous people, tend to show that resilience, perseverance and learning from failure tend to be the keystones of success no matter who the person is. And those are really useful stories. Because they look at, you know, America's Top Model and American Idol, and they look at people who stand on the stage and suddenly become famous, and they say, I want to be like that. But that's ridiculous. You know, if you take any person that they see as a hero, it might be someone who's a singer. If you investigate that person, if you find a biography or articles written about that person, you'll always find out that behind success, I don't mean on the American All-Star kind of thing, I mean people who've actually generated a career in music, a big career, you'll always find there's years and years and years of hard work behind that don't get seen. And so that's worth talking about, and that's worth showing. So I think that's useful. But of course, the person that your children is going to imitate most, the role model they're going to pay attention to most, is you. And of course, the greatest challenge for all parents is to strive to be worthy of imitation. Strive to be worthy of imitation. And that's a hard one, isn't it? To always try and be the best person you possibly can be, so when your children are imitating you, they're imitating someone worthy. And I'm sure you will do that. But it's worth it. Okay. I've got a few more points, but they're very, very simple points, and I'll go through them quite quickly. This is organisational, this is learning. This probably suits the secondary school child a bit more than the primary school child, but maybe applicable in all areas. Number one, make sure they have a place to do schoolwork which suits them physically. As they grow, the desk and the chair should grow with them. And it's got to have good light. It's got to have a place where they can display schoolwork. It's got to be a place set up to learn. If they've got their own place, then it's much more likely they're going to gravitate to that place. But of course, you've got to have it organised. Help build good study habits. Give your children's learning the highest priority in the home for a period of time every evening.
Now, maybe that's possible in your household, maybe not, I don't know, but it's worth thinking about. You know, so can you establish a time slot every evening where homework and study is done? It's a bit difficult when you've got several children, because often they'll have different times that suit them. But if it is possible, you see, you can turn it into a habit. And once it's a habit, then it doesn't take any thinking about it. Your children don't have to think about it, just a habit. As soon as they get home from school, into work, get my homework done. Whatever time suits you. And of course, with these two things, you've got to be aware of distractions. You've got to be aware of things that children would prefer to do rather than study. I mean, sometimes I have parents who say to me, little Johnny just doesn't seem to get his homework done. He doesn't seem to study. He goes into his room, and he's in there, and I go in there an hour later, and he's on his Xbox. And I say, hang on. You mean in his room where he studies, he's got his Xbox? And he's got a television? And he's got a computer? And he's got his cell phone? And he's got all this stuff? And you're wondering why he doesn't study? Yes. So I often talk to parents about help your children learn to build in intrinsic rewards, develop delayed gratification, which means it's perfectly okay to spend an hour on Facebook. Perfectly fine, nothing wrong with that at all, as long as you've got your homework done. It's perfectly okay to spend an hour on the Xbox as long as you've got your homework done. And I think parents should be parents. You should run the system, not the child. The child has difficulty with their Xbox, smash it to pieces. It's simple. It's a good lesson. You know, you can try putting it away in the cupboard, but if they keep breaking the rules, destroy it, smash it, get rid of it. The phone's the same, the TV's the same. If it's not helping them study, get rid of it. Take charge. You are the parent after all. The child should not run the household. You should run the household. Okay, simple enough? And of course, if you can help them learn, use those things as paybacks for getting work done, then they're learning delayed gratification. That's perfect. Okay, to remember what they learn at school, each night they need to read over what they did that day. This is absolutely crucial for getting information into long-term memory. So every night they need to take out what they did at school, they need to read through it again, because that will be then the second time they've seen that information and start the process of moving it into long-term memory. If they only look at it once in class and then don't look at it again until they've got a test, then they've forgotten it already. It's much harder to recall. Very important. Allow them to form study groups with friends as long as they use the time together to get work done. Study groups are great. They can learn from each other, probably better than they can learn from any teacher. As long as they've all, in the study group, they've got the same focus of moving ahead, the same kind of goals. Okay, the last point here is, there's lots and lots of research about immigrant families around the world. People who are new immigrants to a new country. And they outperform people who have been in that country forever. They outperform them by 2 to 1. And they outperform them basically because the culture in that family is a culture of learning. So when a child brings home the homework, it goes on the table and the whole family gathers around and does the homework. Because the parents are getting an education at the same time. But they're all involved, and education has a very high value in the family. And that's a cultural thing. I mean family culture. It's a culture that belongs to certain families. So the trick seems to be to make your family, make the culture of your family a learning culture. It's a very simple thing. It's like this. If your child is reading the newspaper and comes across something they don't understand, a word they don't understand, and let's say your daughter says, "Mum, what does autotelic mean?" In a learning culture family, Mum might say, "I've no idea. Let's get the dictionary and have a look." And she'll Google it, or she'll get the dictionary and she'll look it up, she'll find it, and then they can move on. In a non-learning family, if the daughter says, "Mum, what does autotelic mean?" Mum might say, "You don't need to know that." And that's the difference, you see? In a learning family, everyone's interested in learning new things. Everyone's interested in moving forward. And the idea of learning becomes a family culture. So, nearly finished. Last point. To get to where these are kind of rhetorical questions, you don't need to put your hand up. To get to where you are today, how many of you have to work hard? Anyone have to work hard? Yeah. Anyone have to suffer physically, mentally, emotionally? Anyone have to forego any pleasures in their life? Anyone have suffered personal or business setbacks? And how many of you want to give your children the benefits of your struggle without them having to go through the distress? This is what we want, isn't it? I don't want you to suffer the way I had to suffer. I worked hard all my life to make life easy for you. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. Because how many of you think that the difficulties you've faced, the problems you've overcome, the suffering you have endured have helped you develop the resilience you need to create the success for yourself and your family that you enjoy today? You see, it's in overcoming difficulties that you develop resilience, not by not having any difficulties. So why protect your children from responsibility and the possibility of failure? It doesn't help. So to get right back to where we started, I think all our children need to learn how to earn what they get. They need to learn how to organise their own lives, take responsibility for their own actions, fight their own battles, make their own decisions and take all the consequences, succeed, and on the way to succeeding, fail well. Okay, last couple of things. Here's a good quote. Now, this is not a new problem. Look at the date. Probably around 1800 he said this, that too many parents make life hard for their children by trying too zealously to make it easy for them. Not a new problem. Okay, so here's I've got a couple of things here for you. This is my webpage, it's on the note. On there I've got a section called Tips for Parents. Now what it is, you go there, and it's just a static blog, like I don't tend to add to it anymore. I've got a section for each time of the year. So I've got a heading which might say the beginning of a new school year, or it might say before midterm exams, or it might say after mid-year exams, or it might say before final exams. And it's just you click on it and it gives you what I think parents need to focus on at that time of year. So some people have found that really useful. I've also got a tab which is tips for students. Now what this is a big list of websites, like links to websites that focus on school-based learning, like biology, chemistry, and English and maths and all these kind of websites. Because I'm really encouraging children to use websites to learn from, simply because it's all this learning style stuff. You don't need to know what your learning style is if you've got resources presented to you every possible way. So you go, if you're having problems with maths, you find a website that presents maths as video clips. Does that work for you? No? Okay, you go to another website which presents maths as audio files. Does that work for you? No? You go to another website that presents as interactive games. You find one that works for you, you're off. We don't have to worry about our learning style because the internet is so good at providing school-based resources. There's an amazing amount of stuff out there for school. And yet kids don't tend yet to use it as their primary source of information. I've got articles, links, videos in the blog. Well, that's the same as this thing here, it's just in a different place. Okay, last thing. I have a book. Unfortunately, I only have 10 copies if anyone wants one. 200 pesos is my advertising, it's my marketing. But you can get it in a different way, it's okay. But this is the book of today's course. It's just the book of the exam confidence course, how to pass exams. Now, if I sell all 10, don't worry about it. I'll go to my website and click on it. There's a mechanism there. You can buy it. I'll send them from New Zealand. If there's a big number of parents who would like this book, instead of doing that, what we'll do is get you to give us your name and email address, and I will organise a big bundle of them and send them to Graham, and then he can distribute them to parents. Okay.